So this is part 2 of this reading section. If you did not check out these first 2 slides, make sure that you do before you move on to this one. We're going to talk about slavery in the North first. So one thing that's important for us to realize, we don't have that large-scale plantation system in the North that we had in the South. Instead, small farms and cities dominated the landscape. But slaves were still a really important part of the northern colonies. Enslaved people never came close, however, to outnumbering the population of white settlers, and that was different in the South, as we talked about in the previous video. There was also a greater instance of urban slavery on port cities, for example. Enslaved people could work on docks and shipyards. Some enslaved people worked as blacksmiths, others, and many women, worked as domestic servants. There were some instances where enslaved people had more rights than in the South, though that varied depending on region. So some had greater marriage rights. Some even had the right to bring lawsuits to court. This was relatively uncommon, but the best example that I can think of is when Sojourner Truth sued her former master to free her son, and she won that lawsuit. We can talk about that later because it's one of my favorite examples. She's just a really interesting woman in history. Slavery was more common in the mid-Atlantic, especially New York and New Jersey. One of the reasons why that was because of the legacy of the Dutch presence in the region. So before New Netherland became New York, the Dutch brought their slaves with them to their early colonies. But another reason why that was, when the Dutch left, slavery continued. So part of it was also because of the rural influence of the region. Now, not so much New York, but New Jersey was predominantly rural, which is weird to think about now because it's so densely populated. But at the time, New Jersey sort of acted as the breadbasket for the greater mid-Atlantic. It had lots of farms, and so slavery expanded along with the growth of the New Jersey colony. And one interesting tidbit about that is after America became a country, New Jersey actually was the last state to abolish slavery. In terms of developing an African American culture, and of course this varied again by region, and it also varied on the living situation, right? Enslaved people living on a large plantation had a very different experience than a domestic servant that was one of maybe 2, 3 to 5 slaves living in a smaller farm. So we're going to get into that. So enslaved people were not a monolithic group by any means, especially prior to their arrival in the Americas. So the first generation, they spoke different languages, they practiced different religions. Really, the only thing that brought them together was the fact that they had been enslaved. Future generations had more of an ability to develop a common culture, of course, with language. And developing this common culture was both a survival strategy and a means of resistance against their enslavers. And we're going to get into that more in a second. In terms of religion, again, the first generation, it was more likely for them to maintain some of their African traditions. One of the most prominent ones was the idea that the dead could influence the living. It was sort of a broader form of ancestor worship. But again, as time went on, you will start to see more of an adaptation of Christianity. I'll talk about that again in a second. Again, I said this at the beginning of this slide, but communities really, the development of culture varied drastically based on region and also based on their living situation. So slaves that lived on large plantation societies tended to come in much less frequent contact with whites, just because enslaved people outnumbered their white counterparts. Now, this meant that they could potentially develop more of a unique culture. So, for example, they developed a hybridized language called Gullah, which allowed them to communicate with one another without whites overhearing and understanding them. They often used music as a form of resistance and a common culture. There were a lot of biblical references as Christianity started to spread throughout the South. The land of Canaan, we know that religious significance in the Old Testament, that became a metaphor for freedom for enslaved people. But one thing that's really important to note here, even if the fact that they are in these larger plantations, even if that allowed them to develop a little bit more of a distinct culture, their work was still incredibly harsh, right? Working outside, working on these large-scale tobacco or cotton or rice or indigo plantations by no means was an easy job. So yes, they had less direct supervision, but they did not have it easier. And in urban areas and smaller farms, enslaved people were more likely to come in frequent contact with whites. So if you were a domestic servant, you would come in frequent contact with the mistress of the house. And unfortunately, also, you were much more likely to have unwarranted or unwanted sexual contact with with the white male of the house. And this resulted in many mixed race children, and they were not recognized by their father, and they were born into slavery. Um, so it was also very hard to create a cohesive community that was entirely separate from whites, right? If you were a domestic servant, you were raising white babies, you were living in the same house as your master, so it was very difficult for you to really break free and develop your own unique cultural identity. But nonetheless, Christianity spread pretty prominently in these smaller households. Part of that happens more after the Second Great Awakening, which we're going to talk about in a little while. So let's talk about resistance a little bit, and then we'll call it a day. So resistance took many different forms. One example was just slowing down work, right? And this was also just a matter of self-preservation. If one worked too hard, literally, it was exhausting, back-breaking. Think about how in a previous video I talked about how slavery in the West Indies and Brazil, oftentimes these huge rice plantations, the planters almost purposely would work their slaves so hard that their life expectancy was lowered, and then they would just simply replace them, right? So slowing down work was not only a resistance strategy, but it was a survival strategy. They would often sometimes just play dumb, pretend like they couldn't understand something, or sort of falsify a lower intelligence rate, so in a way, they wanted to sort of avert eye contact, right? Play submissive, and they also would do this so that they wouldn't get in trouble, right? Another thing that they would do, they might accidentally on purpose break a tool so that they weren't able to keep working. And those were all very subtle, covert forms of resistance where it was less likely that they would get caught, less likely that they would get in trouble. The more sort of overt, direct forms of resistance could be met with much harsher consequences, so running away, right? One of the things that was really difficult about running away is it would be difficult for them to really reach an area where they could be truly free. One destination, if an enslaved person was fairly far south, like in Georgia, for example, they could try to make their way to Florida, Spanish Florida, and some of them ended up living with the Seminole population, the indigenous population of the region. But again, if they weren't able to go that far, if they were a fugitive slave, they could be punished severely. There were fugitive slave laws throughout the American colonies that actually would place a bounty on fugitive slaves. And so if one caught a fugitive slave, they could actually make money off of them. So they were never truly safe if they were within the American colonies. And also, of course, there was a threat of violence, right? If they were to run away, they could be whipped upon return to set an example for others to prevent them from running away. And again, I said this earlier, I think, but it was very difficult for a runaway slave to pass as free. I mean, there were even instances when freed blacks were sometimes illegally sold into slavery because it was difficult for them to prove with any coherent documentation that they were free. If they didn't have papers to produce, sometimes the bounty hunters for fugitive slaves would actually sell them into slavery, even if they were free. Uprisings were very rare. The reading does talk about the Stono Rebellion, which took place in South Carolina in 1739. So it was it took place when African-born slaves formed a militia and started marching towards Florida. The book says that as many as 200 people were killed, and that was both blacks and whites. Other figures say that it was more like 75, but nonetheless, the rebellion did kill quite a few before the leaders of the uprising were caught and executed. And the aftermath, ultimately, it temporarily closed the slave trade to the region. There was a fear of newly imported slaves since the leaders of the Stono uprising were not American-born. And even though rebellions were extremely rare, events like the Stono Rebellion were used as cautionary tales, right, against giving enslaved people too many rights. And another consequence is that there were harsher slave codes enacted that further restricted the freedom of movement and other rights for enslaved people. So Even though rebellions were rare, they were often used as an excuse not to grant too many rights to enslaved people. And before we close, I just want to note the significance of this image. This is an image that was created by a white artist, again, to sort of demonize the instigators of the rebellion. We'll talk about this more when we talk about Nat Turner's rebellion, which takes place in 1831. But even if a rebellion took place miles, states away, if you saw an image like this, you would fear, right? You were so afraid of a slave insurrection that it was used as a tool to justify the subjugation of enslaved people. So that wraps up the summary of the reading that you had for today. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching as always. Take care.